Hey friends, it's Iska, and in today's video, I'm going to show you how I went about using my AE Modular system to create a full track for the latest Æther Waves Volume 5. Æther Waves is a compilation album that comes out every year, and it's made up of people submitting their tracks that they've made using the AE Modular system. As you can probably tell by the most recent videos that I've been uploading lately, I'm a huge fan of this system, and I think it's a really undersung sort of synth in the modular world. Now, there were some rules for what you could do with the track, but basically it was pretty much all the sounds had to come from here, but you were allowed to use external effects and external arrangers. Now, during all of my sort of module demos that I do, I usually wind up doing like several demo patches, and I'm constantly jamming on this thing and I find it a lot of fun. But I wanted to try a completely different workflow this time and use Ableton to arrange everything. I probably could have just as easily used the Deluge to do this, but I really wanted to have a really nice mix, and yeah, it was just the way that I went about it. So in today's video, we're probably going to be jumping back and forth between this and sort of a track breakdown in Ableton. You'll sort of see me show how I went about patching up certain things on this system, which really actually wasn't that complicated of a process. And then you'll see the full track in Ableton and all of the effects and sort of tricks I use to make the track sound really good, or at least in my opinion. One final thing, I actually made the album art for this year's Æther Waves Volume 5. So if you want to see how that album art was made, I've put a video up on my art channel, and you should be able to watch the whole thing there. Also, if you buy the album on Bandcamp, all of the proceeds go to a charity called Musicians Without Borders, which is really fantastic. So I highly encourage you to check that out too. So without further ado, let's jump over to Ableton. We'll sort of start the track breakdown and then we'll jump back to here eventually. If you wind up finding the video helpful or insightful at all, please consider liking and subscribing. And now let's jump over to Ableton and kick things off. Okay, so here we are inside of Ableton. And you can see at the top here, I've broken everything up into intro, verse, chorus, and outro. Just to give you a quick preview of the intro. Go into a verse sort of section because we got some bell stuff coming. So let's actually stop now and take a look at everything. So just before we get too carried away with using the AE Modular synth and sort of going over the whole track, I do need to point out one thing, and that is that I have a little effect sort of rack that I built on the Zoia ages ago, and I use that in pretty much everything I upload with my AE Modular system. I just really like the way that it makes it sound. You could do this totally in the box, like in Ableton, but I just find it really helpful to have a little mixing chain set up on this. I've done a quick YouTube Shorts video walking through it before, but I might as well just go over it now. For those that don't know what the Zoia is, essentially it's a modular synthesizer inside of a pedal. So it's pretty much just like this thing, but with a lot of other modules. And yeah, it's very cool and very capable. You can store tons of patches on it and download others. Anyways, so at the top here, we have an audio input jack. So this takes incoming audio and sends it through the chain. And then over here, we've got an audio output jack, which, yeah, sends it into Ableton. Not to get too sort of Zoia tutorial heavy, but essentially the reason that these have like two colors here is because we can see that we've got the left input and the right input. You know, this is the left output and the right output. And then we've got another little notch on the output thing, which is like audio gain. Whenever I click on one of these, you can see that something else is highlighted too, and that shows what it is patched to, just like you would run a cable between these 2 points. So we've got the audio input that comes into a compressor. So we've got the left and right input there, -40 on the threshold, a 4:1 ratio. Then we have the left and right of the compressor coming into a VCA down the bottom here. Now, at the moment, it's just set to 0. And the main reason I do this is just for like a little bit of like volume boost to do some makeup gain. that then comes down to these two effects down here. So you'll notice that the left channel goes to this orange one, the right one goes to this blue one. But these are essentially the same effect. They're just not stereo effects. So I kind of made my own. What these are is an OD and distortion effect. So you can actually go into the settings of these, and then you can come down and choose like different models of distortion and whatnot. At the moment, it's just set to classic. And then the output gain is turned down slightly. So really, this is just me building my own sort of saturator. I think what I would like to do in the future, if I were to rebuild this patch, is pretty much just have these effects only affecting the low end, because it's not very often that I want it affecting the top end. But yeah, this is just the way that it's set up. It's kind of a cheap, lazy way. And then this all runs into this big green module down here. So we've got our left and right input. And then we've essentially got a tone control. And this is kind of like a little makeshift EQ. So you can see that the low end is being boosted. The mids are being dropped. And I can select the mid frequency here. So it's at about 492 Hertz. And then we've got the high shelf is being boosted a little bit. And then there, this all goes out into the audio output. This little pixel thing is nothing. I just put it on there. I could never be bothered deleting it. So yeah, that's essentially like the mixing chain that I've got everything running out of my AE Modular system into. I really like that boost in the low end and boost in the highs, dropping the mids. It's kind of just like what I would do with a guitar 90% of the time, but I find that it just works really good with my synth. So yeah, that's kind of the story behind that. Starting off with the drums, I'll just highlight this and loop it. And let's solo out the drums. So that's our basic 4-bar loop. So just to interrupt here, pretty much all of the drum sounds are coming from these 3 modules here, which are micro modules made by Wonky Stuff. We've got a bass drum, a rim shot, and a hi-hat. So the way I went about sampling all of these was to pretty much trigger it just once using the Euclid grid down here. So at the moment, it's just triggering the bass drum. And I've got my Empress Zoia over here doing some external mixing with the patch I showed before. So the bass drum sounds like this. Nothing too crazy. The close hat sounds like this. The open hat is this. And for the snare, we have to do a couple of different steps. We'll trigger the rim shot first. So that sounds like this. So that's just sort of like our initial impact. We're going to use that same trigger to trigger a VCA over here. We're going to take the noise oscillator and plug its output into that VCA. And sorry, this should have gone into an envelope, my mistake. Then we'll take that envelope and trigger our VCA with it before finally taking the VCA output and plugging it into our mixer. So now we're triggering noise as well. Now that's extremely long decay, so we're just going to turn that down, and we can play around with the volume of the VCA knob to sort of get more control over how the snare is going to sound. So this is really cool because now we can still hear our initial impact underneath this. If we were to take away that, it's kind of just a bunch of noise. So that little bit of the rim shot from the RS55 really makes it sound a lot better. If we open up the drum rack itself, you can see that I've put my samples onto different pads in the drum rack down here. So we've got kick, snare, closed hat, and open hat. And you can see that each one of these is loaded into a simpler device, just for some easier sampling. For example, on the kick over here, I've just done a little bit of filtering. We've also got some on the snare. And if I scroll further down here, you can see that I've adjusted the envelope. We're getting some randomization happening to the volume. And then I've got this hybrid reverb set up. So basically that means that every time I trigger the snare, we get this long pre-delay on the reverb. So we're getting the impact first and then the delay happens after. Which I just thought made it sound really, really cool. Next up, we've got the closed hat. So you can see that I've added on a little bit of an erosion effect here. If I turn that off, it sounds a bit tinny. So I just gridded it up a little bit with some erosion. And then we've got the open hat, which is the same thing. Also in this drum rack, I've got a reverb built into it, just so that I could send some of these to the reverb itself. So if we just solo out these bass drums, you can hear there's a bit of reverb on that. If we look at this sequence, we've got these two open hats here. So I really wanted that sort of double hit with the kicks in there as well. But they just weren't punching quite hard, even though I had the velocity turned up all the way. So you might just notice that on the actual drum rack itself, I've got this open hat spike, and that's literally just mapping the volume of the open hat. So every time those points sort of trigger, we get like a little bit of a volume spike. So we can see that goes up to 6 decibels. As for the rest of the beat itself, you'll notice that there's a slight bit of chance, like 50-50 chance on some of these other open hats here. So sometimes they trigger and sometimes they don't. Just for a little bit of extra variation. Now, if we want to look at the drums here, I'll just jump over to my rack and show you like the Kaestle drum, because that's providing our top loop. So for the top loop, I'm using the Kaestle drum down here. Just to keep things simple, we'll use the internal clock. I'm pretty sure I sort of tempo synced it with my deluge just to match the BPM of the track. But either way, we'll take the drum output, hook that up there. And what I did from there was use this pattern output and plug it into the drums. So we can play around with the decay knob. I'm pretty sure I went for some sort of pitched stuff. And then I might have used an LFO to play around with the decay a little bit. Now, the interesting thing about the Kaestle drum is we can take the minus value here and plug it into feed, and that will shorten the loop to just like 8 steps. But if we actually just touch it on the positive feed, then that's going to randomly generate a whole new pattern for us. So yeah, that's how I went about making the top loop. If we have a listen to this soloed out now, you can see I just loaded it into a simpler and added a little bit of sidechain compression from the kick. So if we put those in together, yeah, I think that sounds really cool. The only other variation that happens to the drums is in this verse section, which we haven't really listened to the whole thing yet. So let's just sort of take it from here. So we can hear that the drums sound a little bit different now. If we go over, we can just see that an auto filter is being turned on, just for that little section there. So that just helps transition into the next part of the song. Next up, let's talk about bass. So the bass, again, is a sample. I'm pretty sure I just got a basic saw wave or a square wave. Yeah, it looks like I've done something. I'm not sure which oscillator I used. It might have been the 2OSC drive or the 555 with a little bit of LFO going into the exponential control. Anyway, if we just have a listen to this soloed out. So after looking over my notes, I actually do remember how I made the bass, and I used a bass sample with the new sampler module down here. So I'm just going to take the output of this module, plug it into our mixer, and then we're just going to trigger it using the Euclid grid down here, just to keep things simple. I'm pretty sure my bass samples are in the C column down here, so let's have a listen. So I've got a lot of bass samples in here, and if you're interested in these are all part of my free sample pack. And I'll leave a link to that down below in the description. So I'm not really sure which one that I used, but I know for a fact that I did put it into the Wasp filter over here, and I'll take that output and plug it into our mixer. And the main reason that I did this is if we have this filter open up all the way, like it just sounds like the sample, but if we start to close it with the resonance turned up slightly, we get like this sort of shimmering texture on top of it, that real resonance drive. And I really liked the way, or like the character that it added to the sound. Something like that. I should also point out that the Zoia patch I showed earlier is giving this a lot more character as well. So I'll just toggle that on and off so that you can hear the sound, or the difference in the sound that it makes. So that to me just sounds like very fat and static, but doing this adds a lot more bass and a little bit more drive. So yeah, that's how I did the bass sound. So if we look down the bottom here, we can see that the filter frequency and resonance is being mapped to like macro 1 over here, and then that's sort of opening and closing up the filter. And we've got an auto filter over here, so it's slowly opening up over time. We're just getting some sort of cool little volume spikes. Some of these are happening on a per clip basis, like in the envelope controls as well. Aside from that, we've got some basic mixing going on, so there's a bit of saturation here just to give it a bit more grit. We've got some chorus. Maybe we'll play it from here. Actually, if I just turn off these 3 effects, you should hear quite a difference. So I'm going to turn them back on. Then we've got a sidechain compressor just to get the pump from the kick, sort of changing it. Followed by a little bit of EQ. And yes, this EQ is mapped to, like the 4th band of this EQ is mapped to the frequency knob, which is also being controlled down here by one of the macro knobs. And then we've just got some volume automation happening here for certain parts of the song where I just wanted the bass to cut out and make room for the high pass bass, which I'm going to play here. So sometimes we want the bass to happen with that. I'll just play these both together. So I just kind of did that to get some little bass stabs in there. And you can see that I've actually Pretty much just high pass this for when it turns on. I had a bunch of other effects in here that I didn't wind up using at all. I was kind of just sort of experimenting to make this sound as gritty and weird as possible. And you can see that I'm playing around with the panning a lot too, just to sort of have this sweep around your head a little bit. So if we listen to the bass and the drums all together, it sounds a little something like this. Now, the next thing to sort of come in here are the sort of drone synth here. So this again is just sampled from the Kaestle module, and I'll try and show that off a little bit soon because a lot of these other samples come from the Kaestle synth. There, you can see that little sort of sweep there. So if we turn on the automation, we can see that I've got a few automation lanes here. We're playing around with the frequency, resonance, drive, and the LFO amount just to get that little... Sometimes it happens longer, like down here. And then finally for the build up. Yeah, I thought that was like a pretty cool sound, and I didn't really do that much to it other than add a little bit of overdrive and EQ. Now next up, I might just quickly talk about the bells first and then the lead section, because that technically covers the whole song aside from these weird glitchy elements I've got going on beneath it. So if we just solo out these bells, so I thought this was a really cool sound. It's basically just a sample from the Kaestle synth again. Now I've put a randomizer on it just to sort of get some different note variety out of it. It's all just playing the same note, but that randomizer essentially just sort of makes it go up and down, and then we're constraining that to a minor scale. I added on some chorus and a little bit of filtering, some erosion just to make it a bit more gritty, some compression, and some EQ. Now this means that every time I play it, it doesn't play the same way twice, and I probably could have rendered this out to audio so that I had a bit more control over that, but I just left it as is, so it was different every time I listened to it. Here's the chorus. Great, so this chorus is a weird one. Essentially, it's, I'm just going to turn off note echo here. Again, more samples from the Kaestle. You can probably tell by now that I actually really liked using the Kaestle on this track. 90% of it is made up of the Kaestle. So we've got this sample. It's filtered a little bit with a little bit of an envelope attached to it. We've also got some EQ going on, some glue compression, bit of filtering with some sort of sine wave to LFO, sidechain compression, got some chorus, and then I use multi-band dynamics. So if we turn this off, it just sort of makes it a little bit less thin, and then we've got some erosion and EQ. Now, what's interesting is this note echo effect is actually a MIDI effect, and it delays the MIDI notes. So you get like a really cool result. This is it without it. Oh yeah, you might notice that there's a little bit of glide on this track that's applied through Simpler. If we turn on note echo, we get these little wobbly slides into the next note, which I thought was really, really cool. Next up, we got another layer on top of this, which is essentially just the exact same thing. However, it's pitched slightly to the left, just down a few semitones. And that way it just provides like a little bit more of like a chord-like effect. If we have a listen to this soloed. And then together. So yeah, pretty neat stuff. And that is essentially like the meat and potatoes of the track. Drums, bass, high pass bass, 2 lead tracks, bells, and a drone. And then really like that's quite boring because I mean ultimately there's not really a whole lot going on in this track. So I just wanted to make it a little bit more interesting. So one of the things I did was create a bunch of stutters, whines, and some rises with the Kaestle. I should have mentioned this before, but for those that don't know, these 2 Kaestle modules are clones of the Bastel Kaestle and the Bastel Kaestle drum. They're made by Wonky Stuff, who also makes these cool drum modules down here. And they're capable of like a lot of really cool, gnarly sounds. Now, at the moment, I've just got it plugged into the output, into our mixer, which I'll just set up here. But it kind of sounds like it's good, but it's kind of unremarkable in that sense. So what I actually like to do with this is plug it into the delay module over here. And then we'll take that delay out and plug it into our mixer. So essentially, I just patched this around a bit. This has 6 different synthesizer models in it, kind of. So we can sort of travel through each of these by using the plus and minus and plugging that into mode. I did a lot of different things as well by plugging things like the stepped output into the wave shape. It only works for certain types of synth engines on here. But I'm just going to sort of patch this around a bit so that you can get an idea of some of the sounds that it can make. And then you can pretty much hear them being translated into my song. Let's switch to a different model now. So yeah, I think that gives you a really good idea of some of the sounds that are out of this thing. It's doing a lot of the builds, the rises, and all of those sort of little glitchy elements that you're hearing throughout the track. So I'm going to solo out all of these, and just know that there is a ton of automation on the stutters. I really wanted to get the sensation that all of these little electrical glitches were bouncing left and right, sort of between your ears. And yeah, I thought it sounded really cool. So a lot of these effects of the Kaestle run through the delay module. I pretty much just twisted a bunch of knobs and repatched it over and over until I got a bunch of sounds that I liked. Now, here's what I mean about the panning. You'll sort of hear this bounce around your head if you've got headphones on. And some of these are sort of pitched up and pitched down and whatnot, just to kind of get like a little bit more of a melodic structure to them. You'll see that a lot of it's filtered out. These tracks have pretty much just got the same amount of effects applied to them, and the panning is controlled with the utility knobs. We got a couple of other cool ones in here. We've got some more here. Yeah, so I think you get the idea by now. There's a bunch of those in there. One other interesting one is there's a cool riser in here, which I thought sounded pretty neat. And that is not the one. Maybe it's this one. So yeah, that's just the Kaestle synth doing its thing. Maybe it's this one. Yeah. I really like that sound, so I just had to use it. So, I mean, yeah, I'll just mute this last thing for now. Essentially, with all of these cool glitchy effects, you get like a little bit more of a journey as you're listening to these basic melodies. Yeah, so I really like the way that those sounded. And finally, that brings us to the last thing that I added to this track. I just wanted to have these tiny little beautiful sounds in there. So I got a little bit creative with this. Essentially, I just recorded out these samples here using Le Module, which is a chord generator. Just to give you a quick demo of Le Module over here, if we crank this up, this cool little chord generator lets you do quite a lot. We've got a frequency knob and a table knob. It kind of adds on extra harmonics. And then the wave down here kind of allows you to change like the shape of the chord. So yeah, that's essentially how I got all of these samples out of Le Module, and then I messed them up with what you're about to see now in the sampler engine. So I took all of those samples and I threw them into a sampler device instead of Simpler this time. This allows me to load in multiple samples that you can see here, and then attach them to a sample selector, which is this knob down here. Now, there's a lot going on here, but it's actually relatively simple. And if you've seen my turning Ableton into a groovebox tutorial, you'll probably understand what's going on here. Essentially, we just got these 4 notes playing on repeat, and I've got a bunch of effects set up. So the redux effect, an auto filter with some weird modulation going on, an auto pan, and some chorus ensemble. Then there's also things like the filter and resonance and the ADSR. So a lot of these controls are being randomly triggered by the expression control. So basically every time a new note happens, this random sort of randomizer randomizes these effects, which are all from here just mapped onto these knobs, to different values that I can get like a little bit more control, but some randomization. And then essentially all of these pink samples up here are taken from that. So if we just have a listen to this track on its own, it's never going to play the same thing twice, or shouldn't. We can see a lot of these controls being randomized here. So they're almost like little sort of guitar strums that you would hear. So I'm going to turn that back off for now and turn on this other track. And yes, these are some of the ones that I wound up with. I just EQ'd them and added a little bit of overdrive. It's probably my favorite one. And yeah, if you listen closely when you're listening to the whole track, you get these nice, beautiful little sounds. So yeah, and that is essentially the entire track. Now, if I just go to the master effects here, I just want to pretty much go over my master chain or my mixing chain. So we have a glue compressor, saturator, EQ, and another EQ. This EQ is mainly just to boost the lows. Usually I boost the highs a bit, but I was fine with that. It drops the mids, and I just pick out some harsh frequencies that bothered me throughout the entire track and drop them out. And finally, I just wanted a little bit more oomph in the lower end, so I used multiband dynamics just to sort of pump that a little further. Finally, you'll see that there's utility set up here. This is just so that I could knock it down to the headroom it needed to be at. There is a limiter, and I usually put this limiter on everything, but because it's going to be mastered by somebody else, that's turned off for now. And then this thing is just so I can stream this video. So if we turn some of these effects off, and I'll just group them for now and have a listen, and maybe we'll just listen to the chorus. Yeah, we can just pretty much hear that it makes everything sound better. Anyways, I hope that you found this video somewhat informative, or at least gave you a bit of an insight into how the track was put together. I do kind of feel like I cheated a little bit because it's basically just an Ableton track made with a ton of AE Modular samples. But, you know, that was allowed. And I think next year I'll probably have a few more modules and try a completely different workflow. Anyways, I hope that you found this video helpful or insightful in some way. Let me know if you have any questions or thoughts down below in the comments. I've kind of always wanted to use my AE Modular system in this way. I've just never really had time to sit down and do it. And yeah, what an awesome experience. It was so fun to just sort of sample a ton of different stuff out of this and manipulate it with a couple of external effects, and then throw the whole thing into Ableton and use Ableton to build a track from just those sounds. So yeah, I definitely urge you to go on and have a look at Æther Waves, check out all the other cool tracks there. I'll make sure to leave a link down below in the description. And yeah, hit the like if you like, and if you don't, tell me why. Please subscribe, check me out on Patreon, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.